Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I am Phyllis Zimpler Miller, and today my guest is Oren Schneider. He was born in Israel, and he is the author of okay, Oren, show your book, the nonfiction book, The Apprentice of Buchenwald, the true story of the teenage boy who sabotaged Hitler's war machine, which is his grandfather's story. And I'm going to have him start right in, and then I'm going to interrupt him when he's not specific because I am very interested in timelines and showing how things moved around. So start with where your grandfather was born, and we'll go from there.
Hi, Phyllis, and thanks for having me. My grandfather Alexander was born Alexander Rosenberg in 1927, November 2nd, in the small town of Sechovce in Czechoslovakia. Today it's in eastern Slovakia near the triangle border with the Ukraine and Hungary.
Okay, and how long did he live there before the Nazis rolled into town?
So the Nazis rolled into town in 1942, but the origins of fascism started popping up in the mid 1930s. His family was affluent and well connected in upper echelons of eastern Slovakia. His parents operated a specialty department store in the middle of town, catering to the needs of the region's elite. The mayor was their best customer. He never paid. Um,
Sorry.
which was a calculated investment on their part that
Right.
that served them well if you ever get to read the book. But it's, at some point, father disembarks a train at the train station and sees this big sign: Jews go back to where you came from, and he comes back home, and Alexander is 8 or 9. And he says, but we've been here, living here for 12 generations. Where exactly are we expected to go? And things obviously only deteriorate after that. So in 1942, there's a selection in the small township. Only 10 Jewish families are allowed to remain. All the rest are being put on trains and taken to Poland, to the death camps in the Lublin area. Because this family is affluent and well connected, they get this white certificate, one of the 10 families who's allowed to remain there, but they remain in an apocalyptic situation where a third of the town's population vanishes overnight. The entire main street, all the stores, the butcher, the doctor, the teachers, they're all gone, and they're counting their days until their day arrives. And at a time where you need a pink certificate to remain in town, then, I mean, the mayor can't help them anymore, and they concoct a plan to escape to another town and actually team up and help a local fascist run their business. Father is a very astute, experienced, and successful store owner, business manager. He's able to help that Nazi until the day that Nazi sends him an envelope and says, I can no longer protect you, but here's a set of blank papers. I mean, do your best and good luck. And they change their name. They're no longer the Rosenbergs. Now they're the Ruziaks. They use a local Gentile name, and they go underground and hide in the capital of Bratislava. And they go through difficult times. Obviously, they're playing for time, right? The war is nearing its end. They want to make sure that they're not captured until the Soviets or the Americans make it there and sort of beat the Germans. But at some point, father, who's no longer able to provide for the family, is weakening, and he basically gives away their hiding place to a Jewish informer. The Jewish
Oh,
informer
wait,
the
wait,
next
wait.
day.
Give it. No, no, you can't just skip over that part. He means he mistakenly tells someone. Is that what you mean?
Yes, so he walks around. So the son, my grandfather Alexander, becomes a typewriter technician, and he makes a little money that allows them to eat and pay for their lodging. The father walks around the street aimlessly and depressed, and he meets a friend from the from the old town, and he says, "Oh, Dov, it's incredible to see. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm hiding like you are. Let's get together. Let's bring the families together." And obviously, this guy, threatened by the Germans, is a German informer, and the father it's strict to give away their hideaway place, their location, and their identity. And the next day, a truck filled with Wehrmacht soldiers um, park in front of the house and take them to a Gestapo roundup place. They're taking to the Novaki concentration camp in Moravia in Western Czechoslovakia, where they're separated.
Okay, wait. Well, we're saying they, but could you tell us how many people?
So father, mother, and son. They're a family of three. Solomon, the father, who's referred to as Zoli. They speak German, Hungarian, and Slovak. The mother, Irene, and the son, Alexander. So Zoli and Alex are taken to Buchenwald. They don't know what happens to
Wait,
mom.
from the work camp.
Yes, from the concentration camp, which is basically a transfer camp. There's people stay there for hours to days. Typically, before that time in 1944, they managed to run the clock. It's already 1944. In the past, those transports would leave to Auschwitz and Treblinka. Now the railroads are bombarded. I mean, they did their job. They basically ran the clock to make sure that they're not taken to the death camps, so they can only go north to Germany. So they're taking to Buchenwald. They
Which
don't
is
know
in
where,
Germany,
which
right?
is in northern Germany. Yes, it's the
Okay.
largest Reich-operated concentration camp in all of Europe. It's mainly hosting POWs, but you have everything. You have gypsies and prison and criminals and homosexuals, and you have everything from everywhere. Um, and by that time, the camp is overflowing. They're building the small camp, like a tent camp. The main camp is all wooden barracks, but they're initially hosted in the tent camp. Mother is taken to a place they have no idea what happens to her. So at that time, it's just the both of them. Alex, end of 1944, is a 17-year-old teenager. He's not gone to school for 4 years now, ever since they shut down the Jewish schools in Setrovce and they had to live underground. The father is a shadow of himself, and they're trying to get by in the freezing nights of the winter of 1944 and 45.
Yeah.
Um,
Which was a very cold winter, even for
it,
that part of the country.
yes, which was a very, very cold winter. And one morning, 2 weeks after they arrive, in a roll call, um, the Nazis are looking for an interpreter. They're looking for someone who masters a number of Eastern European languages as well as German. Father Solomon, he spoke 7 languages, a very intelligent man. He volunteers, and he basically grabs Alexander and says, "Come with me." Alexander is scared and he says, "But my number was not called. I mean, if they find me in this where they're taking us, that's the end." But Solomon takes a risk. He basically takes his son with him, and they're asked to go into a small barrack in the administrative area of Buchenwald, and all these prisoners disappear into these offices, and only two remain. There's only one name on the list, and young Alexander, the 17-year-old whose number is not on the list, understand that may be the last moments on the planet. And obviously, the Germans understand that one person should not be there. They identify Alexander, and he starts getting a beating of the sort that he had never imagined, and he starts shouting his lungs out. "Father, save me! Father, save me!" And lo and behold, the door of the administrative office opens. A well dressed gentleman in a three-piece suit comes out. And this person is the manager, the German manager of the military industrial complex of the Buchenwald camp, where most of the weapons, guns, and cannons are produced for the
I assume he's going to say the
last
Wehrmacht.
previous hours as an interpreter, and he understood that this person could be very valuable to him. He typically brought into his factory Soviet POWs. They're 17, 18-year-old people who were uneducated, and he had found this 44-year-old individual who's a business owner who masters accounting, operational processes, and translations, who turns to him and says, "He's shouting outside. That's my boy. Could you please save him?" So at the request of the prisoner, who's sort of uh, has to save his son, that big boss, big Nazi boss, it goes out of that administrative bunk and asks the guards to stop beating that bleeding boy. They bring him inside. They save him in the last minute, and that evening, the father and son are put on a truck with a group of 30 forced laborers and taken to the Gustloff factory in the outskirts of the Buchenwald camp, where they produce the most important individual piece of weaponry for the Wehrmacht in World War II, which is the Mauser 98 rifle. You watch all these war movies, you watch all these German soldiers and officers, they all hold the Mauser 98. This is the the visual that is most synonymous with the German military. Um, and obviously, Father, with all his experience, is being nominated to manage the warehouse, the spare part warehouse, and there's nothing to do with young Alexander. So young Alexander sits there, and the manager of the factory, and he's bleeding and he's injured, says, "Well, maybe you'll clean my office," and they start from with little baby steps, and a few weeks later, Alexander becomes very close with that head Nazi, with that manager of the factory, whose son is also named Alexander. He calls his son Lexa, so he calls young Alexander Lexa, and he's becoming invaluable for the manager. His office has never been so clean. He also gets another job as the shift runner in the weapons production. Um, and the prisoners see this young boy who's become very, very close with the manager of the factory, um, and he's also grateful and to the manager of the factory. But you typically you follow that Stockholm syndrome. You have a hostage who becomes very, very close with a person who's aiming a gun to his head and is holding him hostage. Um, until that one day where walking through his shift, he's being called in Russian by a very senior Soviet prisoner. And he's basically telling him, and Alexander understood because he spoke Slovak, and Slovak and Russian are very, very close. He basically tells him, "Look, I'm a brigadier colonel from the 4th Airborne Soviet Division. I'm here to make sure that the Nazis and the Nazi regime collapses. I need your help to bring them down." And you see that boy who was in the cusp of death a few weeks earlier, who's being saved by the top Nazi in northern Germany, turn around and betray that top Nazi and becomes a central cog in that sabotage that destroyed hundreds or thousands of weapons that were produced and being sent to the front lines. And it was done in a very smart way. And Alexander, who was incredibly adept and capable with his hands, understood immediately the mechanisms and the ways in which the prisoners could collaborate and team up in making sure that whatever they do in the factory is not discovered while in the factory, but only takes effect in the war field, in the battlefield, where the German soldiers start shooting their rifles and they basically don't do their job. Um, all goes well until one day the air raid siren goes off and the American bombardment of northern Germany begins in February of 1945. Um, the factory is demolished, is destroyed. Many of the workers lose their lives. Alexander gets separated from his grandfather.
So his father.
Um, from his father, who's taken for medical treatment in the main Buchenwald camp. He survives by teaming up with French paratroopers who were prisoners who taught him how to survive on eating some of the freezing greens out there. But these are weakling prisoners, they have nowhere to run. They live in an encampment around the destroyed factory. They're being taken by the bomb squads to help them um, sort of make sure that all the bombs that are still lying in the ground from the U.S. bombardment are being picked up. So they can go back into camp. Um, Alexander thinks that's the end, but then in a roll call in one of these mornings, they're being asked whether there's a typewriter technician right there, and he's weak. He doesn't hear. Only for the third time that it's being announced, he says, "Yeah, I was a typewriter technician in Bratislava before I was captured." He gets another beating for letting the officer scream it 3 times, but all of a sudden, he becomes one of the most important cogs for the Germans overnight, repairing all of the destroyed Mercedes typewriters after the Allied bombing of Buchenwald. And he gets warm food, and he gets all the recognition he can get from the Germans. And he's being left alone to deal with the typewriters in his own laboratory. Um, and when he's left alone, he's able to snoop around, and he finds a treasure. I'm not gonna divulge the type of the treasure that he finds there, but that's a fascinating story. He uses his treasure um, to pay. He becomes the holder of the only tangible currency around Buchenwald in the months leading to the Americans coming and saving them, and he uses his newly found currency very smartly for a 17-year-old, and he finds his way to his father, who's a Muslim. He weighs.
Do
Um,
you want to
I,
explain
I,
that expression?
so in
Uh,
these camps, these poor prisoners, many of them died of hunger. They didn't have there was very little nutrition that they had access to. They lost weight, and when you saw them kneeling, skeletons, they looked like people praying. And in those times, they refer to them as the Muslims who were praying and kneeling in the direction of Mecca, and they were referred to as Musliman. Uh,
Wait,
so
wait, but
so
if you said about someone, he is a Muslim, okay, whatever you just said, in the camps, it meant he was on the way out, that he mentally had checked out and he,
checked out, complete hallucinating. He looked like a ghost, and he was on his way to the world of ghosts. So he found his father like barely standing, barely breathing, and his father is happy to see him to just say goodbye, and he says, "No, Dad, I have currency on me. I'm going to make sure that you're going to survive." And he basically made sure that he's able to find the corner, the time, and the access to nutrition to allow his father to slowly recover and to stay alive. And just a few days later, hearing the noises, the explosions, and the light weaponry firing, and they saw the American Third Army. Rush into and break down the walls and the barbed wire of Buchenwald. Unsure initially whether it's the Soviets or the Americans, Alexander runs out. He sees that Patton tank, and he's the happiest person. Um, they still spend weeks in Buchenwald because they have nowhere to go. The roads are bombarded. The war is not formally over. He spends time making sure that his father regains his strengths. He's being interviewed by the American officers. His testimony is being taken. He wanders around. He breaks into German homes around to see if he can find anything that he can exchange for food and money so they can actually pay for their long way back. Um, and eventually they're being released slowly but surely for different parts of Europe when the railroad back to Slovakia is fixed. They're put on a train and they get back to Bratislava, and they go into the the big signs in the train stations where they try to find mother's name. They can't find it, but they go to the last known location where they had a relative, which is one of mother's sisters, and they found her there. She was liberated just weeks before they were. She was liberated by the Soviets from Ravensbrück concentration camp. So
Which
all that time,
we
also in northern Germany,
also in a women's camp.
women's camp. So when they were working in the big Mauser factory, she was working in the Siemens factory in Ravensbrück, making parts for the V1 rockets that the German shot. And she was also very, very lucky to be alive. And they're united, scarred, barely standing, but united. And they spend months in Bratislava, picking up the ruins of their lives. They travel back to Sečovce, to eastern Slovakia, where mother confronts all her good friends who took over her house, her furniture, her jewelry, her treasures, and she blames them for not standing up for her and her family, and she disconnects from them. Um, my
Wait, did they
grandfather,
wait, did they get their house back or not?
no, they do not get their house back. They don't want to get their house back. Um, so father takes over a family store in Košice, in the big district town, manages it temporarily for them to make a living. Um, my grandfather meets a charming young lady called Judith Ackerman, who is also a survivor, who had her own amazing story. She's an avid Zionist. She goes to the Jabotinsky camp in eastern Slovakia and gets army training so she could go to Palestine and volunteer with the young army of the yet to be announced Jewish state. And Alexander needs to make a decision. Does he travel to the United States and unite with uncles who left the township before the war, or he gets married and goes to Israel, and he follows his heart. He marries, he goes and gets military training,
Where
and
does
they
he get
get on the
married?
boat.
Where does he get
So
married?
the Haganah and Etzel operated training camps in Czechoslovakia for camp survivors, young camp survivors. So Judith gets anti-aircraft training in weaponry. He's a weapons expert. He's just worked in a gun factory for the longest time for the Germans. So he just deepens his expertise, and they both make it to Israel. They disembark on January 1st, 1949, months after the Declaration of Independence and the commencement of the hostilities with the Arab armies, and they're both sent to the front. And they fight the war, and
Wait, are they
uh,
the same unit?
no. So they're separated. Obviously, women at that time are not going to the front. Alexander is going to the front, and he's trying to explain, guys, you got it all wrong. I'm a weapons expert. Don't put me in. I mean, in the battalion up front, I can help you like manage weapons. At the end of the day, he manages to find someone who understands Hungarian, who is able to translate to the army the value of that young Slovak Jew, who's now part of the young Israeli army. And he does wonders managing his weapons depot. And one of the most amazing stories that he tells through his years is the time where they get these shipments of the Czech rifles, which were very famous at the time, that were a savior for the Israeli military, and he gets a whole bunch of defected guns, and he knows exactly what's wrong with them because
Right,
he
because
was part of the wrecking crew that destroyed these weapons, and that's really a closure. That circle closes for him, and he manages to survive the War of Independence. And they have two children, my mother and her brother, and they raise a beautiful family and build a fantastic business, a consumer electronics and office automation business. Initiated with his invention, he was the first ever to create a Hebrew writing typewriter that writes from right to left. He
oh,
brought
how
all this
interesting.
expertise from the war and from his apprenticeship. And he helps the young country of Israel do business. He sells these typewriters to banks and the Foreign Office and others, and they're able to use typewriters to write in Hebrew. So he's incredible stories about him. So, and
Wait,
he
wait,
raised me. Yes.
wait, before you get there. Was he able to reverse engineer those weapons and save them for the Israeli army?
So I think that to some extent, yes, many of them were irreparable.
I was just curious.
Yes, but at least when he came across one of these weapons, I mean, he knew what the problem was, and he was able to know whether he can only
Right.
use these parts as spare parts or that gun was reusable.
Okay. I just wanted to know that. So go ahead. I think you started to say he raised you. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I was orphaned at a very young age. My father was an Air Force pilot, and he died while in service. And so this young grandfather, Holocaust survivor, was faced with a challenge that was difficult even for him, with two kids at home and a daughter who's a medical doctor doing long shifts at a hospital, and he had to raise us, my both my grandparents, and sort of he chose. His choice was to tell us, or at least tell me, everything. So growing up at a very young age, I knew of the concentration camp stories and a lot of the horrors that he had seen growing up in his town during his escape, during his time at the camp, and through his liberation. Um, and so to me, it was very natural growing up in Israel, surrounded by many Holocaust survivors. It was very natural to me that everyone had a Holocaust or a camp survivor in their home and knew all these stories. And only growing up did I acknowledge how unique it was to have a family member like him. And more than that, a family member who wanted to share, who wanted to tell these stories, who didn't want to escape them. I mean, he went through these terrible times at a very, very young age. And I think that enabled him to really seal that box, put it deep inside, and build himself a new life unscarred, and create a unique life philosophy that was extremely positive. He always said, life is beautiful and you should always think positively. And most importantly, if you don't take care of yourself, no one else is going to take care of you. And these are all lessons that he took from his difficult years growing up in Slovakia and his survival through the camp. And through the years, I had the privilege of traveling with him and sort of going through his path from his town to the camp. He grew up in the lap of a vibrant German culture. That's what he loved. He loved going there every year, the German speaking environment, whether it's Switzerland or Austria or Germany. He wanted to be served and serviced by the Germans. That was his pleasure to be there every year and show that he survived, and enjoy the standard and culture of his choice, without being shy of who he was and where he came from and what he was. And it was just an incredible experience growing up with that person.
And did he get pushback from others of I would say his cohort who said, "Why do you talk to your grandchildren about these stories?"
I think that these were personal choices everyone made. I think they each respected each other's traumas, personal traumas, generational traumas. Each had their own way of dealing with this. I don't think that they talked a lot about it between themselves. I remember the Hungarian card tables, and every Saturday night the ladies in the living room and the men in the study playing rummy and poker, and they just focus on living the good life and living the life of Israel in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. I barely remember them talking about the old times, or they didn't do it in front of me. And I think that what they chose to share with family members or tell to family members were all very personal choices. I don't recall him ever talking to his friends or his age cohort, or like Slovak Hungarian cohort about sort of what he shared or didn't share with his family members.
Could you just explain for those of us who have, I have bought a map it's a puzzle for 4 years and above that I have in my living room, trying to remember the different countries. But why do you say, when you were talking about the card tables, Hungarians, which is not the same as Slovak? So, would you like to explain a little bit about that for those of us who are
So you
challenged?
you remember all these jokes about that Jew who traveled to 7 countries before he was 20, but he never left his home. So during these days, wars and political shifts and changes, these these geographical areas change hands very, very often. There was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where that township, Sabotage, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then when the Austro-Hungarians lost the First World War in 1918 and Austro-Hungaria was broken down to pieces, the young country of Czechoslovakia came out of the ashes, where Slovakia was part of it. And in 1939, where the Nazis annexed Bohemia and Moravia, which is today's Czech Republic, the country of Slovakia came to be. And after the war, Czechoslovakia became that part again. So in the east, specifically the eastern Slovak area was extremely Jewish for multiple generations, and those communities um, belong to, I mean, were separated between artificial borders. So Hungarian and German were considered extremely cultural and sophisticated languages, whereas Russian, Ukrainian, Slovak were less so. They're more languages of commoners. So you would have people living beyond the border in the Hungarian side that spoke the exact same languages and shared the same culture as people who lived in the Ukrainian side and people who lived in the Slovak side, and towns like Munkac that had different names in Hungarian, Slovak, and Ukrainian. And these were the exact same people that were living in three different parts of the border, which were artificially separated by political changes in their regions. But same culture, same languages, same Jewish communities.
That's why I just wanted to clarify when you talked about the Hungarians after the war. It's okay. So clearly, at that time, Hungarian was their language of choice when you were
Yes.
growing up.
Yes, at home they spoke Hungarian, but when I attempted or tried to seriously take on Hungarian, they refused. They said, "No, you speak Hebrew. That's our language here, and you force us to speak Hebrew with you, so we speak Hebrew." So the Hungarian was lost, unfortunately. My mom used to speak it really, really well, but when they passed away or were no longer communicating with her, she had no one to speak to in Hungarian. And in our generation, there's no more Hungarian, unfortunately. I mean, I can still understand many words and I know my way around a menu in Hungarian, but that's about it.
It's an important skill.
It's
Well,
very important.
as we come close to the end of this charming conversation, why did you decide to write your grandfather's story?
First of all, he was the most influential person on my personal development. Many of the things that I am, I owe to him. Um, we remained very, very close until his very last days, and since childhood, I've been recording him. I don't know why. He was a technology focused individual at a time where technology was not a thing, but he was always curious about the next thing, how analog becomes digital, how a teleprinter becomes a fax, becomes email. He was very passionate about it. So I had all these recordings, and I always knew that I had my own treasure trove, and one day I'll have the time, the attention, and the priority to actually do right with these memories. And COVID came, and I remember it was March 15th of 2020, and I was just shutting down my offices in my company and furloughing dozens of employees and sitting in front of a bottle of bourbon and saying, why is all this happening? And I remembered all these recordings, and I understood that there was a reason for me to go through that period and that it was my time to go back and remember all these many hours with my grandfather and listening to all of his testimonies, his and his mother's testimonies that I've recorded. Um, and I've done some important work on learning the basics of writing biographies and writing history. And I've been doing a genealogical research for the longest time, for over a decade. So I had a great mapping of the family and the tribe before the war and after the war. And I sat down for a few months, and I turned all these recordings into a story as a tribute to him. And I'm overwhelmed and heartened by all the reactions I'm getting from readers. And I'm taking every opportunity I have to speak in front of these readers, especially young adults, students, and especially in front of high schools here in Brooklyn, but elsewhere, also JCCs in the New York area. I've spoken in the Reagan Librarian Foundation in California and in other places, and I love the fact that people react the way they do to the book. People associate the Holocaust with Anne Frank, and they have their own view of a Jew in a war. And I think that Alex's story is a story of resistance, is a story
Absolutely.
of fighting back. And I think it's very, very important for me to show that aspect of Jews during the war. They didn't all go to Auschwitz. They didn't all end up in Treblinka. They all have incredible stories, and each story is different, and each story is worth telling. I was fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to spend time with the survivor and get to know him and get to know his soul. Um, and I had the opportunity to and the resources to enable me to bring the story to everyone who's interested.
Well, I'm really glad you did, and I'm really glad you came on the show to share it. And I will, of course, put the name of the book underneath the description of this talk and a link to Amazon, but it's not an affiliate link, just to be, I like to make that statement so that you should know that I'm recommending this story as a fascinating piece of this whole, I'm going to use this word, jigsaw puzzle of the Holocaust that is so much wider than most people realize, and how it's so important for us to bring these stories. I just saw a documentary on the concentration camp of Jews in Libya. Who knew?
Yes,
I hope to. I had no idea. So, because we always talk about extermination of Jews in Europe. Libya is not in Europe, but there was a concentration camp there. So
yes.
it's incumbent on us who know these, I say stories, but I mean true accounts, to share them wherever you can. So I thank you, Oren, for sharing it with us. I thank our listeners. And this is how I end this particular playlist. I say, may the memories of the victims and the rescuers be a blessing forever.
Thank you for doing this, Phyllis.